When I told my husband to leave for a week, I meant it the way angry wives in ordinary marriages mean things they never expect to become legends. With a shaking voice in a kitchen full of half-folded laundry and unopened mail, with my hand pressed flat against the counter because I knew if I pointed at the door I would start crying, with the rain tapping against the window and the refrigerator humming like it wanted no part in what was happening between us. And if you had stood in that kitchen and looked at the two of us, at me in my wrinkled work clothes and him in that faded gray sweater he wore whenever he felt himself shrinking inside his own skin, you would not have thought the next 7 days would undo almost everything I thought I knew about marriage, about honesty, about the neat little boxes people build around the people they love. His name was Daniel, and for 11 years I thought I understood him. I thought he was quiet because quiet was his nature, gentle because he disliked conflict, hesitant because life had worn him down in the same slow way it wears most adults down, through bills and deadlines and old disappointments that stop feeling dramatic and simply become the furniture of a shared life. I thought his habit of touching fabric in department stores was absent-mindedness. I thought the way he always volunteered to iron pillowcases and table runners was one of those odd domestic preferences people collect. I thought the softness in his voice whenever he described beauty, whether it was a well-set table or a polished mirror or an old film costume, meant nothing bigger than taste. That week taught me how dangerous it is to mistake silence for simplicity. The fight itself was almost embarrassingly normal. My Aunt Eleanor had died 3 months earlier and left me her old boarding house on the edge of Belmere, a small town 3 hours north where the streets still had names like Willow Lane and Chapel Row, and where every second building seemed to lean as if listening to the past. The house had been empty for years except for the occasional caretaker visit, and I had to decide whether to sell it, restore it, or let it continue becoming a memory with peeling wallpaper. Daniel had promised twice to help me go through it, and twice found reasons not to. First it was work. Then it was the car. Then he said the place made him feel strange, which irritated me more than it should have, because grief does not like vague excuses. I was drowning in practical tasks while he drifted around the edges of them, apologizing in that soft voice that used to calm me and had lately begun to feel like surrender. That evening I came home to find that he had not sent the estate inventory to the lawyer, had not called the roofer, and had somehow spent an hour reorganizing the linen closet instead. The linen closet. I remember laughing once, a sharp laugh that sounded cruel even to my own ears, and saying, "Of course. You couldn't do the hard thing, but you could alphabetize towels." He flinched at that, and I saw instantly that I had hit something tender, but I was too tired to stop. Words came out of me that had been waiting months for their turn. I said I felt alone. I said I was tired of being the only adult in the room. I said I did not understand why every real decision slid off him as if he were coated in oil. And then, because pain always looks for a target large enough to blame, I pointed to the stack of papers from Belmere and said if he could not be a husband in this house for 1 week, then he could go be useful in another one. I told him to take the keys to Eleanor's boarding house and not come back until he had sorted every room, every drawer, every ghost. He looked at me then with an expression I still think about sometimes, not anger, not wounded pride, but something like the terrible relief of a person who has finally been given permission to do what he was secretly desperate to do. "A week," he said quietly. "You want me gone a full week?" I said yes. I remember that word very clearly. Yes. He nodded once, and instead of arguing, instead of defending himself, he went upstairs. That should have frightened me more than it did. Daniel was not a storming out kind of man. He packed carefully. He came down with 1 suitcase, his shaving kit, the file box of estate papers, and the old brass keyring. He paused by the door as though waiting for me to call him back, and for one suspended second I nearly did, but pride is an ugly little guard dog, and mine was barking too loudly. He left. I locked the door behind him and leaned my forehead against the wood. I told myself the week apart would help. I told myself he would go to Belmere, sort the house, remember what responsibility looked like, come back steadier, more decisive, maybe even grateful for the push. I told myself many stupid things that night. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning in the form of a text. Reached the house. Power's on in half the rooms. Found the inventory ledger. This place is exactly the way your aunt left it. Then, after a minute, another message appeared. Strange how some houses wait for people. I stared at that sentence longer than I meant to. Daniel was not usually poetic unless he was upset, and even then he would apologize for it. I wrote back, just get through the dining room and front parlor first. The lawyer needs the furniture list. He replied, I will. The next few hours passed in the sharp efficiency that follows a fight. I cleaned things that did not need cleaning. I answered emails too quickly. I opened the fridge just to shut it again. Around noon I noticed something odd. The kitchen towels hanging over the oven handle had been folded into perfect thirds. Daniel always did that. I had laughed at him for it once, saying nobody in history had ever cared about the geometry of a dish towel, and he had smiled with that shy little shrug and said, maybe not, but I like things to look cared for. By evening I was angry again, because grief and guilt like to take turns wearing each other's coats. He sent another update. Front hall done. Silver polished. Curtains opened. Dust everywhere. There was a photograph attached, and that photograph is where the unease truly began. He had taken it from the entrance of Eleanor's boarding house, looking inward. The black and white tiles of the hall gleamed. The umbrella stand shone. The staircase banister looked newly waxed. But that was not what held me. At the far end of the hall, just near the service door leading toward the kitchen, there was a blurred shape caught in the reflection of the long mirror my aunt had kept by the stairs. A dark figure with a pale front, like someone wearing black with a white apron. I enlarged the image until the pixels broke apart, but the shape remained. I told myself it was Daniel carrying linens. I told myself it was a trick of light. I told myself a lot of things I no longer believe I actually believed. I texted him, "Who's in the mirror?" He did not answer for nearly an hour. When he finally did, the reply was short enough to make my throat tighten. Just me. I typed back immediately. You don't look like you. No answer came that night. I did not sleep much. Belmere had lived in my childhood as a place of long corridors, cold sinks, and quiet women. My Aunt Eleanor had run the boarding house with military precision when I was small, though by the time I was old enough to notice details, the boarders were gone, and the place had become a mausoleum of polished wood and closed rooms. She spoke often about standards and presentation, and the dignity of labor. She had once employed a housekeeper named Mrs. Vale, who wore dark dresses with white collars and moved with the silent competence of a person who believed chaos was a moral failure. As a child, I had found her half frightening, half fascinating. Daniel, on the other hand, had always been captivated by stories about the place. On our first visit after we married, while I rummaged through drawers for old photographs, he lingered in the pantry examining labeled jars, folded tea towels, rows of pressed napkins bound in ribbon. He said the house had a rhythm to it. I rolled my eyes and said, "Only you could find romance in storage." He had smiled then, but there had been a sadness behind it I did not understand. On the second day, he still did not call, only texted. Kitchen underway. Found old household accounts. Your aunt kept everything. There was another photograph, this one of the kitchen table laid out with ledgers, polishing cloths, and stacks of recipe cards tied in blue string. At the edge of the frame, I could see a sleeve. Black fabric. White cuff. My skin went cold. I phoned him at once. It rang 6 times before voicemail picked up. His outgoing message was the same as always, calm and anonymous. I left a message trying to sound practical. Daniel, call me. I need to know what's going on. And if there's someone there helping you, just say so. I won't be angry. But I was already angry and hurt and frightened in that humiliating way people are frightened when they fear they are the last to know something. If there was another person in that house, who was it? A caretaker? A woman from town? Some stranger he had hired? The thought arrived uninvited and poisonous. Maybe he had gone to Belmere not because I sent him away, but because he had somewhere else to become someone else. The third day, a package arrived. It was a plain cardboard box with Belmere's postmark and my address written in handwriting that looked like Daniel's except neater, more slanted, almost old-fashioned. Inside was the silver dinner bell from my aunt's house, polished so brightly I could see my own startled face in it, along with a folded note on cream paper. The note said, "The house remembers what it was built for."
So do I.
The bell belongs on your table. There was no signature, only a small ink mark that looked like an M. I sat at my kitchen table with that note in my hand and listened to the silence of my own house. I wanted to be furious about the melodrama of it, but fear had moved in and taken the best chair. I called Belmere's only general store, because in small towns the general store knows where your own family does not. A woman named Ruth answered. When I asked whether she had seen my husband, she laughed softly and said, "The tall one at Miss Eleanor's place." "Oh yes, honey. He came in for starch, floor polish, sewing needles, and flowers." Said, he wanted the front hall to look proper again. Flowers. Sewing needles.
Starch.
I nearly dropped the phone. Was he alone? I asked. There was a pause. Then Ruth said, in the careful tone of someone deciding how much truth a stranger can bear, "I only saw one person, but the second time he came in, I almost didn't recognize him. Different coat. Hair done up somehow. Very polite. Paid cash." I do not remember hanging up. I remember driving. I remember stuffing the note into my purse, grabbing Eleanor's spare keys, and taking the highway north with my mind running far ahead of the car. Rain smeared the windshield. Every mile felt like a dare. By the time I reached Belmere, it was almost dusk, that blue-gray hour when old towns look as if they've stepped backward in time. Eleanor's boarding house stood at the end of Sycamore Lane behind an iron gate that had once been grand and was now merely stubborn. The front windows glowed. That alone was unsettling. Daniel rarely turned on more lights than necessary. I parked beneath the bare branches of the sycamore and sat gripping the steering wheel, telling myself I was about to walk into something explainable. People live on explainable things the way they live on bread. I let myself in with the spare key. The house smelled of lemon polish, lavender starch, and something simmering gently in the kitchen. It did not smell abandoned. It did not smell haunted. It smelled run with intention. The entrance hall was immaculate, the old umbrella stand restored, the tiles buffed, the mirror gleaming. A vase of white carnations sat on the side table beneath it. The dining room doors stood open, revealing a long table covered with a crisp cloth and a line of candlesticks awaiting evening. My aunt's portraits had been dusted. The sconces shone. Somewhere deeper in the house I heard a floorboard creak, then the soft thud of footsteps, measured and light. "Daniel," I called. My voice sounded vulgar in that perfect house. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed close. Then, from the back of the hall, near the service corridor, a figure appeared. For one frozen second, I truly believed I was seeing a ghost from my childhood. The person standing there wore a plain black dress that fell below the knee, a white apron tied neatly at the waist, white cuffs buttoned at the wrists, and a narrow, white collar framing the throat. Dark hair was pinned up in a smooth twist. The face was Daniel's and not Daniel's, because every line in it had been brought out differently by composure, by a little powder, by a softness around the eyes I had never seen when he was trying to be my husband in the way he thought the word required. He had no lipstick worth naming, only a natural tint, and yet the change was so complete that my body stepped back before my mind caught up. He clasped his hands in front of him, and in a voice barely above a whisper said, "Claire, I was going to call tonight." I do not know what I expected him to do when confronted. Rip off the apron, laugh, apologize, say it was a joke? But he only stood there, neither defensive nor theatrical, looking terrified and relieved at the same time. "What is this?" I asked. It came out harsher than I meant. He lowered his eyes, then raised them again, as if correcting some old habit of shame. "I think," he said, and his throat moved on the words, "it's the first honest thing I've done in years." I remember staring at him and hating the calm of the room, the way the carnations kept blooming in their vase, as though the world had not tilted under me. "Honest," I repeated. "You disappear for 3 days, send me cryptic notes, and I find you dressed like—" I stopped. "Like what?" "Like a maid. Like a woman. Like a secret. Like a person who had stepped out of the side of my marriage wearing its missing truth." "Say it," he said, not unkindly. "You find me dressed like a maid." His voice did not break on the word. Mine almost did. "Daniel, what are you doing?" He glanced past me toward the dining room, toward the staircase, toward the house itself, as if the answer existed in the wood and wallpaper better than it existed in him. Cleaning, he said first, and despite everything, a disbelieving laugh escaped me. He gave a small, helpless smile. I know how that sounds. Insane, I said. It sounds insane. He nodded. Maybe. But I need you to let me explain. Not in the hall. Please. Every instinct in me wanted to run, to demand, to accuse, to drag him back into the known world by the sleeve. Instead, I followed him into Eleanor's morning room, where the curtains had been tied back and a tray waited on the small table between two chairs. Tea, sliced bread, butter, jam, the kind of orderly comfort my aunt would have approved. He had prepared a conversation like a household task. That hurt me more than if he had broken down. He poured tea with steady hands, though I saw the tremor in the cup when he lifted it. Up close, I could see how carefully he had done everything. His brows had been tidied. His hair, partly his own and partly helped by some small dark piece pinned cleverly into place, framed his face in a softer shape. The dress was not costume shop nonsense, but something made or altered with respect, plain and exact. The apron had been ironed until its folds could have cut paper. There was nothing mocking in it, nothing sexual. That somehow made it harder. If it had been a joke or a thrill or a provocation, I could have fought it. But it sat there before me with the gravity of a prayer. When did this start? I asked. His fingers tightened on the teacup. The wanting to dress this way? I nodded. He looked at the floor for a long moment. Before I had words. Before I had shame. Maybe before I knew there was a difference between those two things. I said nothing. The house settled around us with old wooden sighs. Finally, he continued. When I was a child, my grandmother used to let me help her in the mornings. She wore aprons every day. Not fancy ones. Cotton white trim, pinned just so. She taught me how to fold sheets, how to polish glass, how to set a tray. I loved it, not only because I liked order, because I liked the feeling of becoming careful.
Soft.
Useful in a way that didn't feel like pretending. My father caught me once wearing one of her aprons and said I looked ridiculous. My mother cried as if I had broken something sacred. After that, I learned what parts of myself made rooms go cold. He gave a brittle laugh and lifted one shoulder. So, I became a boy, then a man, then a husband. I learned every role except the one that let me breathe. I wanted to interrupt, to say that I had not forced him to be anything, that he had chosen our life too, but some wiser part of me knew that defensiveness would only protect my self-image, not the truth. Why now? I asked. Why like this? He looked around the morning room, and for the first time a kind of wonder warmed his face. Because your aunt left traces everywhere. Her lists, her routines, the service staircase, the wardrobe upstairs. Claire, I came here angry at you and ashamed of myself. I meant to spend the week proving I could do one practical thing right. Then I opened the linen room. His eyes met mine, terrified of my reaction and unable to stop anyway. There was an old trunk, aprons, uniforms, mending baskets, gloves, notes on starch ratios, a book of household management with marks in the margins. It felt absurd, I know. But the moment I touched those things, it was as if all the noise in me went quiet. I put one apron on just to see. Then I cleaned the silver. Then the hall. Then the kitchen. Every room I restored made me feel less split open. He swallowed. I wasn't becoming someone else, Claire. I was becoming impossible to lie to. I sat there with my aunt's teacup warm between my hands and tried to reconcile the man before me with the person I had slept beside for 11 years. Memories shifted in new light. Daniel pausing too long before hotel mirrors. Daniel volunteering to steam my blouses, then pretending it was only because I hated ironing. Daniel's strange fascination with old domestic films. Daniel once saying, after he passed a shop window displaying a black dress with a white collar, "There's something beautiful about clothes that are all function and grace," then laughing too quickly and changing the subject. My heart hurt with recognition, and with the uglier realization that I had seen many of the signs and called them quirks because that was easier than wondering what they meant. "Does this mean you're a woman?" I asked finally, and the question trembled between us with more than grammar inside it. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know everything yet. I know I am not only the man everyone sees. I know that when I look in the mirror dressed like this, I don't feel mocked or disguised. I feel arranged correctly. Maybe not completely. Maybe not forever. But truly." He looked down at his hands. "I found a name that settles me.
Danny.
Not because I'm trying to erase Daniel. Because it sounds like the part of me that was always waiting in the next room. I would like to tell you I handled that confession with grace, with immediate compassion, with the kind of wise love people applaud in stories because it flatters them to imagine they would do the same. I did not. I set my cup down too hard. Tea sloshed into the saucer. "So, what am I supposed to do with that?" I asked. "You leave as my husband and reappear as a maid named Danny, and I'm just supposed to what? Nod and say welcome home?" His face changed then, not with anger, but with the old habit of making himself smaller so other people could occupy the whole room.
"No," he said.
"You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be hurt. I have hidden this from you, and hiding has its own cruelty." His voice thickened. "I didn't tell you because every time I tried, I pictured your face, or my mother's, or every laugh I heard growing up, and I lost my nerve. Then I stayed quiet so long that silence became the shape of our marriage." That landed harder than any accusation. Silence had become the shape of our marriage. He was right, not because he alone had made it so. Because I had learned to treat his silences as convenient until they became unbearable. Because I had loved the parts of him that made my life easier and mocked the parts that made me uncomfortable. Because every marriage writes a secret contract in invisible ink, and ours had apparently included a clause stating that Daniel would be gentle but not too strange, domestic but not too sincere, pretty in spirit but never in presentation. I hated seeing my own signature on it. Still, revelation does not cancel shock. I stood up abruptly. "I can't do this right now." He rose too, instinctively. "Claire, no, don't." I pressed fingers to my temple. "I drove here because I thought maybe you were with someone. I thought maybe you were losing your mind. I don't know what this is, but I can't absorb 11 years in one afternoon." He nodded immediately, too quickly, as if he had expected nothing else. "Take the guest room, or drive home, or stay here. I don't care. I just need air." His eyes flickered with pain at the word guest room, at the small accidental demotion of our intimacy, but he only said, "Of course." I walked out before I could start crying in front of him. Outside, evening had thickened. I made it as far as the car before the tears came, hot and humiliating and angry because they were not tidy tears of betrayal or clean tears of compassion, but the ugly mixed kind that belonged to major rearrangements. I cried for my confusion, for his fear, for the life I thought I had, for the absurd detail that kept haunting me most, that he had ironed the apron. In the middle of the biggest confession of our marriage, my mind would not let go of the ironed apron. Maybe because it proved intention. Maybe because it proved care. Maybe because it showed this was not a momentary collapse, but a deliberate becoming. I drove to Belmere's only inn and took a room above the pub, where the wallpaper had roses on it faded almost to ghosts. I barely slept. At dawn I went back to the boarding house not because I had achieved peace overnight, but because curiosity and love are sometimes stronger than outrage, and I still had both. The front door was unlocked. Somewhere upstairs I heard the soft rhythm of brushing, then the swish of fabric. I followed the sound to the second floor and found the old linen room open. Danny, stood at the center table with stacks of napkins arranged around him like paper petals. He was wearing a different dress, charcoal this time, with a white bib apron and a narrow belt. Sunlight from the tall window struck the dustless shelves and made the whole room look suspended. He saw me in the doorway and froze. I did not speak. I simply looked. The room itself had become an argument. Shelves that had sagged under chaos were now labeled. Torn pillowcases had been set aside for mending. Tablecloths lay sorted by size and condition. On the far wall hung 3 old photographs I had never noticed before, freshly cleaned and propped against the shelf until he could frame them. In one, a younger Eleanor stood in plain working clothes beside 2 women in service dresses outside the boarding house kitchen. In another, a stern woman I recognized as Mrs. Vale stood with a straight-backed teenage boy carrying folded sheets. "Who's that?" I asked before I could stop myself. He turned, following my gaze. "I found writing on the back." He picked up the photograph gently. "It says, Samuel Vale assisting his sister during influenza season, 1958. He looked at me. Mrs. Vale's sister died that year. She couldn't manage the whole house alone. Her younger brother helped her. There are notes about him in the housekeeping ledger. She taught him everything. She wrote that he had a maid's precision and better manners than the gentleman." A strange chill went through me, not supernatural but historical, the recognition that nothing is ever as unprecedented as people pretend. Hidden lives leave breadcrumbs in ledgers, in margins, in unnamed photographs. Danny handed me another item he had found, a small notebook bound in cracked blue cloth. It belonged to my aunt. Her handwriting marched across the pages in decisive strokes. Household accounts, menu plans, repairs, reminders. But between those practical entries were fragments that changed how I saw her. No home becomes gracious by accident. Somebody chooses care daily. Uniform is not shame if it is chosen. Service can hide a person, yes, but it can also save one. I read the lines twice. Danny watched my face but did not press. "Do you think she knew?" I asked. "About you?" He gave a sad little smile. "Not exactly. But I think she knew that some people need structure to let truth out without being devoured by it." He hesitated. "There's more." He led me to the attic room at the back of the house, a room I had always hated because of the sloping ceiling and the smell of trunks. Now the windows were open. Fresh air moved the lace curtains. At the foot of the bed sat the trunk he had mentioned. Inside were folded uniforms, old petticoats used more for shape than display, gloves, hairpins, aprons with embroidered initials, pattern pieces, and a stack of letters tied in ribbon. The top letter was addressed in my aunt's hand, to the one who finds herself by caring for what others neglect. My breath caught. "It says herself," I whispered. He nodded. "I know. Was this for someone specific?" "I don't think so. Or maybe it was once. But the person never claimed it." He held the letter out to me, and I opened it with suddenly clumsy fingers. The paper crackled like dry leaves. The letter was not long. Eleanor wrote about reinvention in the language of household duty because perhaps that was the only language available to her generation. She wrote that some people are not made sturdier by performance but weaker, that there is a kind of truth which can only be approached sideways, through ritual, through clothing, through a task repeated until fear loses its voice. She wrote that dignity is not located in how others name us, but in whether we can bear our own reflection. At the bottom, she had added, in a slant that grew more personal with the line, "If the apron steadies your hands, wear it. If the name in the mirror is gentler than the one outside it, answer to the gentler name until you know your own strength." I sat down on the attic bed, because my knees decided for me. My aunt, strict Eleanor with her clipped vowels and her impossible standards, had left behind a letter that could have crossed decades to land in Danny's trembling hands. The world did not become simple because of that letter, but it became larger. And in a larger world, my shock no longer felt like proof that this was wrong. It felt like proof that I had been living in a smaller map. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I asked, not as accusation now, but as a genuine reaching. He leaned against the trunk, and for the first time his composure cracked. "Because I loved you," he said, and tears rose suddenly in his eyes, startling him. "And because I loved you, losing you was the one disaster I could not rehearse. I could imagine my parents cutting me off. I could imagine strangers staring. I could imagine my job falling apart. But I could not imagine you looking at me with disgust. So I kept delaying the truth until delay became a life." He laughed once, painfully. And then you sent me here as punishment, and instead of feeling abandoned, I felt freed. That's awful, isn't it? It's honest, I said, and we both heard the echo of the day before in that word. I asked him then about the practical things because grief always circles back to the practical when it gets too deep. Where had he gotten the dresses? Some were altered from garments in the trunk. One he had bought from a thrift shop in town. He had stayed up late sewing because his hands needed something to do while his mind caught up. The hairpiece had come from an old costume box Eleanor once used for community theater events. He spoke of these details not with flamboyance, but with careful embarrassment, as if each answer cost him something. He had practiced walking because he did not want to feel clumsy. He had tried different ways of pinning the collar because one made him look like a parody and another felt right. He had looked in the mirror and cried so hard the first night he thought he might be sick, not because he hated what he saw but because he recognized it. I listened, and the world rearranged itself inch by inch. By afternoon we were sitting together in the kitchen shelling peas for no good reason, except that the task made talking easier. He told me about the years before we met, about stealing moments in hotel bathrooms during business trips to drape towels like skirts, and then standing there ashamed of the relief it brought him. He told me about buying a white blouse once in college and throwing it away the same day. He told me how our marriage had been real, deeply real, but incomplete because he was always editing himself down to the parts that felt survivable. I told him about my own side of the silence, how I had mistaken his passivity for indifference when perhaps much of it had been fear, how I had loved his gentleness but also weaponized it when I wanted him to become simpler, sturdier, more recognizably masculine under stress. Neither of us pretended those admissions repaired anything. They simply cleared the fog. When evening came, I should have driven home and given us both time, but instead I stayed. We cooked soup together in Eleanor's kitchen, and because the old range heated unevenly, we kept having to shift the pot. At one point Danny reached past me for the salt, and his sleeve brushed mine, and the familiarity of that tiny touch nearly undid me. I had spent 2 days imagining I had lost my husband to some unknowable stranger, and yet there he was, still apologizing when he bumped my elbow, still tasting the soup with exaggerated seriousness, still humming under his breath when concentrating. Difference and continuity lived side by side. It was possible, I realized, for a person to become startlingly more themselves and still remain recognizably beloved. That insight did not arrive as comfort. It arrived as responsibility. The next morning we drove back to the city together. He did not change into his old clothes first. He asked me in the front hall, hand on the banister, "Would you rather I did?" I looked at him in the neat black dress, the white collar, the apron tied with unfussy precision, and understood that the answer mattered beyond the car ride. "No," I said after a long breath. "If you change only to make this easier for me, then we start lying again." He closed his eyes for half a second, as though absorbing a blow that was also mercy. The drive home was one of the strangest of my life. We stopped for petrol. A man at the station looked twice, confused, and then away. At a roadside cafe the waitress called us ladies, corrected herself, and turned pink. Danny thanked her kindly, and I watched how carefully he held himself, not coy, not theatrical, just intensely alert, like someone learning whether the world will permit his existence if he is very polite about it. I wanted to protect him. I wanted to shake him. I wanted my old life back. I wanted the new truth, not to hurt. We reached home by late afternoon. The house felt smaller than before, full of the evidence of our previous arrangement. His old boots by the door. His shaving mug in the bathroom. The framed wedding photo in the hall, all tuxedo and lace and cheerful certainty. Danny stood in the kitchen and looked around as if he were entering a museum dedicated to a version of himself he could no longer fully inhabit. "I can change if you need time," he said again. "Not forever. Just for now." "I don't know what I need," I admitted. "Then maybe we begin there," he said. The first week after Belmere was not romantic courage and noble acceptance. It was awkwardness, crying, practical negotiations, and moments of absurd domesticity so ordinary they felt surreal. We agreed he would work from home for a few days while he figured out what he wanted to tell his office. We agreed I could ask questions without him hearing them as rejection, and he could decline to answer without me hearing it as abandonment. Some mornings he dressed in his old clothes because he felt too exposed. Other mornings he appeared in simple skirts, blouses, or one of the restored house dresses from Belmere, and every time my stomach flipped with a new combination of grief and awe. The maid attire itself remained central for him, not because he wanted to perform servitude, but because it was the clearest visual language he had for order, care, and feminine selfhood, without frivolity. "It helps," he told me one evening while ironing aprons at the kitchen table with maddening concentration. "The structure of it, the rules. I don't have to improvise who I am every second." That made painful sense to me. People underestimate how much clothing can function as scaffolding. He began calling himself Danny at home. Hearing the name the first few times felt like stepping onto a stair that was not where my foot expected it to be. But names, like rooms, change shape as you live in them. What proved harder than names was the way his entire body relaxed when he was dressed in a manner that aligned with himself. He moved more gracefully, yes, but also more firmly. Decisions came faster. He no longer apologized for every opinion. He stopped drifting around tasks and started completing them with startling efficiency. It infuriated me for a day before I recognized the reason. The competence I had begged from Daniel was arriving now from Danny, and part of me resented that truth had liberated abilities shame had strangled. One night, after he had reorganized the pantry in a burst of energy that turned our shelves into a work of art, I snapped, "So all this time you could have been this decisive?" He stood very still, a jar of lentils in his hand. "No," he said quietly. "All this time I was spending so much energy pretending that there was very little left for living." That sentence embarrassed my anger into silence. Not everyone else was so easily embarrassed. My sister learned first. She dropped by unannounced on a Saturday and found Danny in the front hall in a charcoal dress and apron, polishing the mirror frame while humming softly to himself. Her face went through surprise, confusion, and offense with humiliating speed. "Claire," she said in the voice people reserve for gas leaks and scandals, "what is going on?" There is no elegant way to explain a revolution in your marriage to someone who still thinks gender is a pair of shoes you either fit or do not. I tried in the choppy language of someone still learning the terrain. My sister listened with arms folded tighter and tighter across her chest. When I finished, she stared at Danny as if he had tricked us all with an expensive illusion. "So this is a phase?" she asked. Danny, who had been standing with one hand lightly resting on the cloth in his other, answered before I could. "No," he said. The phase was my silence. She did not come back for 2 months. His mother was worse. She cried on the phone, then became icy, then sent messages about confusion and dignity and what the neighbors would say. His father refused to speak to him at all. Danny read the messages in the small morning light by the window, face composed beyond what any child should need to master, then set the phone down and asked whether I wanted tea. I watched him that day and understood something new about courage. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is a person in a clean white collar making tea with steady hands after opening a message designed to make those hands shake. The office came next. Danny had worked for years as an accounts manager in a company dull enough to make beige feel ambitious. He requested remote leave, then finally asked for a meeting with human resources. He dressed plainly for it, a navy skirt, blouse, cardigan, light makeup, nothing resembling the maid presentation that felt most truthful to him, because he knew the world could only swallow so much honesty at once. He came home afterward pale and exhausted but not defeated. "They want time," he said. "Policies, pronouns, appearance guidelines, the usual slow machinery." He laughed without mirth. They kept saying they valued authenticity as if they were trying a foreign phrase. He was allowed back eventually, though the atmosphere remained brittle. Some colleagues adapted. Some stared. One old manager called him Daniel twice in a meeting and then, upon correction, said, "It's hard to keep up." Danny replied, "I've been trying to keep up with myself for 40 years. You can manage a memo." I heard that story later and felt a completely irrational burst of pride. And yet, for all the external battles, the hardest work still happened between us in the small hours. We were not a symbol. We were two people sleeping badly and trying not to turn each other into villains or martyrs. I grieved the husband I thought I had, not because he was dead, but because the role itself had changed shape. Danny grieved the years he had disappeared inside that role. Sometimes those griefs collided. Sometimes they held hands. There were nights I lay awake listening to the soft rustle of his nightgown when he turned in bed and thought, I do not know if I can do this for the rest of my life. There were mornings I watched him pin his hair carefully and thought, I have never seen you so peaceful. Both thoughts were true. We talked more honestly than we ever had. We also wounded each other more honestly. Once, during a late-night argument about whether he wanted to transition more broadly or simply live between categories, I blurted out, You tell me you don't know, but every week there's another step, another revelation, another thing I'm supposed to absorb. He sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tight in the blanket, and said in a voice so tired it stripped the room bare, Do you think I enjoy being a moving target? I am not changing to torment you. I am changing because stopping would finish me. There was nothing theatrical in that. No manipulation. Just a simple statement from a person nearing the limit of what concealment had cost him. I sat down beside him then and wept into my hands because the tragedy was not that he was becoming himself. The tragedy was that he had believed for so long that becoming himself would destroy everything. Belmere remained our strange anchor through all of it. We started going there on weekends to continue the restoration. At first it was practical. Then it became ritual. The house, once a weapon in our fight, slowly turned into a workshop for our new truth. Danny threw himself into the rooms with a devotion bordering on sacred. He repaired curtains, scrubbed grouting, catalogued china, mended old linens by hand. In Belmere he wore the maid dresses almost exclusively, and there, within those old walls that already understood hidden lives, I stopped flinching. I began to see how precise the presentation was for him. The dresses were not costumes of fantasy, but uniforms of identity, a way of saying who he was through discipline rather than drama. He preferred sober colors, white aprons, polished shoes, crisp cuffs. I feel held together, he told me once while knotting an apron string. The world is noisy. This isn't. Over time I helped. Not with the dressing itself at first, but with the practicalities around it. I learned to starch aprons the way he liked. I fetched pins. I hemmed a sleeve. The first time I fastened the back buttons of one of his dresses, my hands shook so badly I had to redo the top 3. He stood very still, not wanting to startle me, and said softly, You don't have to do this. I know, I whispered. That's why I am. It was one of the tenderest moments of our marriage, and one of the saddest, because tenderness discovered late always carries the shadow of all the years it might have arrived sooner. Belmere also brought other people. Ruth from the general store began dropping by with bread or gossip. She looked Danny up and down the first time she saw him properly, and simply said, Well, no wonder the place is finally shining again. Then she handed him a pie as if nothing in the world required explanation. An elderly carpenter named Mr. Pritchard came to repair the porch railing and, after a pause that felt like a century, asked whether Miss Danny wanted the new wood stained dark or left natural. That quiet accommodation nearly made me cry more than the cruelty had. Acceptance is often unspectacular. It arrives in invoices and pie tins and the correct use of a name. By autumn, the boarding house had transformed enough that people started asking whether we meant to reopen it. The idea first came from Ruth, who said Belmere lacked a decent guest house, and that Eleanor's place had too much backbone to remain empty. I laughed it off. Danny did not. I could see the thought taking root in him, not as business fantasy, but as a life he could imagine inhabiting. A house with rooms, he murmured later as we stripped wallpaper in the blue guest room. A place where care is visible, where presentation matters, where I could be useful exactly as I am. I looked at him then, hair pinned up under a scarf, sleeves rolled, face smudged with plaster dust, and felt the future move for the first time from abstraction to possibility. Reopening Belmere would require money, courage, public visibility, and a decision about us that no amount of private tenderness could postpone. Were we still husband and wife? Wife and spouse? Something beyond the old categories? Did staying mean genuine commitment or simply my inability to leave a person in the middle of a storm? These questions did not hover politely. They sat at our dinner table. One night, I asked the hardest one. If I had not followed you to Belmere, would you have come back? Danny put down his fork. The room went very quiet. Yes, he said, then corrected himself. I would have come back, but not as Daniel pretending nothing had happened. He held my gaze with painful steadiness. I might have come back and lost you anyway, but I would have come back honest. That answer hurt precisely because I believed it. The title of what happened to me would always sound ridiculous to people who wanted neat entertainment from other people's upheavals. I sent my husband away for a week. A maid came back. It sounded like a joke, a dare, a parlor trick. It was none of those things. What came back was a person wearing the only language that had ever made him feel whole. What came back was my marriage stripped of its easiest assumptions. What came back was work. By winter we decided to test Belmere as a seasonal guest house for the holidays. We advertised modestly. 3 rooms only. Home-cooked breakfasts. Historic atmosphere. Danny designed the menus, restored the silver service, and chose staff aprons for himself that were so beautifully cut and severe they made the house look as though it had remembered its own spine. I handled bookings, accounts, and permits. It was the most effective partnership we had ever had, built not on the old myth of natural roles but on the startling fact that truth can make people competent in ways shame never will.
Guests came.
They noticed everything. The polished banister, the folded towels, the little vase of winter berries in every room, the person in the immaculate dark dress who carried tea with the grace of someone born to it and introduced himself as Danny, proprietor. Some guests blinked. Some did not. Most, to my lasting surprise, cared more that the fire was warm and the breakfast exceptional than that the proprietor looked like an Edwardian housekeeper reinvented for the present day. One elderly widow from Bristol took my hand after supper and said, "Your partner has the gift." Not many people know how to make a room feel safe. That sentence lodged in me. Safe. For years I had wanted safety from change, from discomfort, from the risk of social embarrassment. Danny had wanted safety from himself being exposed before he had the strength to survive it. Belmere, in its old-fashioned way, was teaching us a different meaning, safety as a space where truth is not punished into absurdity. But the world outside Belmere did not disappear simply because we had found our rhythm. A local paper did a feature on the reopening and included a photograph of us in the front hall. I wore a navy dress and pearls. Danny wore one of his black house dresses with a white apron and collar, standing straight beside me with one hand resting lightly on the table where the guest register lay open. The article was mostly kind, but once it circulated online, the comments arrived. Some sneered, some mocked, some treated us as a curiosity. I made the mistake of reading too many. By evening I was furious, protective, and ashamed of my own vulnerability to strangers. Danny found me in the kitchen with my laptop open and my face burning. He closed the screen gently. "Don't give them our furniture," he said. "What?" "Space in the house." He touched the counter. "Let them rattle around outside. They don't get chairs at our table." It was such an Eleanor thing to say that I burst into startled laughter through my anger. He smiled then, and in that smile I saw Danny, my old life, my new one, all layered without canceling each other. That winter, just before Christmas, he asked me if I would help him with something. We were in Belmere's dressing room, the small back chamber off the old service stairs where a narrow mirror hung between hooks and shelves. On the table lay a new uniform dress, deep black wool with a modest flare, white collar edged by hand, apron starched but not stiff, cuffs turned with tiny pearl buttons. "I made this," he said, almost shy again, "for opening night supper. Will you help with the back?" My throat tightened. "Of course." He stepped into the dress and turned. I drew the zipper up, then fastened the tiny hooks at the neck. He attached the collar. I tied the apron. He adjusted the belt. In the mirror, I watched both of us watching the transformation settle over him, not like disguise, but like relief.
His face softened.
His shoulders aligned. His breathing deepened. "How do I look?" he asked. It was not vanity. It was a genuine question from someone offering me the truth of himself and asking whether I could bear to witness it fully. I met his gaze in the mirror.
"Like you came home," I said.
He shut his eyes, and for a second I thought he might cry, but instead he laughed under his breath and said, "You have no idea what that means to me." Opening night supper was full, the dining room lit with candles, the old silver reflecting gold across the tablecloths. I moved between guests with wine and bread. Danny emerged from the kitchen with the soup tureen in his hands, and the entire room seemed to pause, not because he was spectacular in any conventional way, but because he carried himself with such exact calm that attention gathered around him. I watched a young couple exchange a glance, then smile at him with unforced warmth. I watched an old man stand to help with the door without making an issue of anything. I watched Belmir receive him, as if the house had been waiting all along. Somewhere between the soup and the apple tart, while laughter rose from one end of the table and snow began to whisper against the windows, I understood that my life had not broken in the way I first feared. It had broken open. That is less tidy. It asks more. But it is not the same as ruin. We still had hard days. We still do. There are mornings when I miss the ease of the simpler story I used to tell about myself and my marriage. There are days when Danny returns from the city exhausted from being observed, corrected, categorized, and made symbolic by people who will never know the ordinary miracle of how carefully he folds fitted sheets. There are practical questions still unanswered about identity documents, about language, about whether he wants medical changes or none at all, about how the future will name us. Our intimacy had to be rebuilt in gentler forms before it could become anything more. Trust comes before closeness, when truth has been delayed so long. None of that fits the neat fantasy some people want from a transformation story. But the longer I live inside this version, the more I distrust neatness as a sign of truth. The real transformation was not the dress, though the dress mattered. It was not the apron, though the apron steadied his hands. It was not even the name, though the name opened a door. The real transformation was this. My husband had spent years performing the kind of manhood he thought would make him lovable, and when I sent him away in anger, he found the courage to return in a form that risked everything except his own reflection. And I, who thought honesty would look like apology and conformity, had to learn that sometimes honesty arrives wearing white cuffs and carrying a silver tray. The sentence that stays with me most from those days did not come in the attic or the kitchen or the car ride home. It came months later, on an ordinary spring morning after the last guest had checked out and Belmir stood briefly quiet between seasons. I found Danny in the front hall on a ladder changing the bulbs in the chandelier. He wore a pale gray morning dress, white apron tied neatly, hair pinned up, pencil behind one ear because he had been updating the supply list. Sunlight ran down the staircase. Dust motes turned lazily in the air. I looked up at him and felt one of those sudden surges of tenderness that arrive without warning and make a whole life visible in an instant. "Careful," I said automatically, because ladders make me nervous. He smiled down at me. "I am careful," he said. Then, after a beat, more softly, "I had to become careful to survive." Something in me broke and mended at once. I climbed the last 2 steps and kissed his wrist because it was the nearest part of him I could reach. He stared at me, startled, and then his face changed with a quiet joy so deep it hurt to witness. That was when I knew the story was no longer about whether I could tolerate his truth. It was about whether I could honor it. So yes, if you insist on the shortest version, it is this. I sent my husband away for a week and a maid came back. But the long version, the true version, is that the maid had always been there in fragments, in the folded towels, the polished spoons, the longing glances at collars and cuffs, the exhaustion after every performance of manhood that won applause and left him emptier. The week in Belmir did not invent Danny. It removed the furniture covering the door. And when that door opened, nothing in our lives stayed arranged the old way. Not the marriage, not the house, not my understanding of love. There are evenings now when I stand in Belmir's kitchen watching him move through the last tasks of the day, checking the pantry ledger, setting tomorrow's breakfast things in order, smoothing the cloth on the sideboard with the flat of his hand. The house is warm. The hallway smells faintly of beeswax and tea. Guests murmur behind closed doors upstairs. He turns at the sound of my footsteps, and sometimes for just a split second, I still see both people at once, Daniel and Danny, the husband I knew and the self who had to dress like a maid to finally come home. Then the split second passes, and I simply see the person I love. Not simplified. Not explained away. Not reduced to a title fit for gossip. Just true. And if you ask whether I regret telling him to leave, I will tell you the answer that took me the longest to earn. I regret the anger. I regret the years we both spent inside silence. I regret every joke I made when I should have asked a gentler question. But I do not regret that week, because the road to Belmere was the road to honesty, and honesty, however badly timed, however strangely dressed, was the first real mercy either of us had shown our marriage in years. Sometimes late at night, when the guests are asleep and the old house creaks around us like a living thing settling its bones, Danny rings the restored silver bell once from the kitchen just to hear the sound move through the corridors. The first time he did it after we reopened, I looked up from the register and laughed, asking what on earth he was summoning. He leaned against the doorway in black dress and white apron, candlelight catching at the clean line of his collar, and said, with that quiet smile that contains every version of his face I have ever loved, not who,
What?
order, courage, home. I thought then that it was the most dramatic thing I had ever heard in a kitchen, and also the truest, because in the end that was what came back to me after the week apart. Not a trick, not a scandal, not a stranger wearing my husband's eyes. Courage came back. Order came back. Home came back wearing an apron, and I opened the door.